Well. Welcome back, one and all, to Spark Stream. Hopefully, this is coming up well, but today is a very touchy subject, so we're gonna jump right into it because something that's been a debate for centuries, right? God. I believe God does exist, but not in the way that you think, or that anyone else has really thought, but kinda did, surprisingly enough. And it has to do relative to reality itself, existence, and just everything, and how it is. The very same fundamentals that drive us to exist over time, the harmony that has to be maintained in order for that to happen, while it battles the chaos that happens from non-understanding and from natural disorder. So, here we are today, now, to go over the premise. Hi, YouTube. If you're on YouTube or Twitch, like some, I'm going to be putting this on YouTube after. Might cut some bits out, might not, depending on how it goes. So, God and existence, right? Now, to start, if we look at like the just the definitions of them. When it comes to reality, one, the world or state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them. I mean, yes. That's reality, that is fact. A thing that is actually experienced or seen, especially when this is grim or problematic. It's talking about extremes, but regardless of that, we're focusing on a thing that is actually experienced or seen. A thing that is experienced or perceived. As seen is fundamentally, by definition, a faculty of perception. Right? It's a sense. And when we talk about senses, you start to go down the rabbit hole. We can start looking at perceive. But first, let's do sense. This is the rabbit hole that I'm going to bring you guys down in order to show you, at least, God does exist, but it's not a person, it's not a being, necessarily. It's a lot more simple than that, and it also explains the reason why humanity itself has always put the idea of God as an explanation for reality, as an explanation for the universe itself that allows us to exist. So, little sneak peek into the whole philosophical aspect of that, as I trip over my words. Now, when we look at the definition of sense, a faculty, right, by which the body perceives an external stimulus. One of the faculties of sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. Now, when we start talking about these senses, right, sight is facilitated by optical sense, the ability to perceive the world as is. There's a lot of things that don't have that. There's a lot of things that don't have smell. But even when you talk about biological life forms that might not have some of these faculties, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not conscious, right? Someone's blind, they're still conscious. Someone can smell, they're still conscious. They still have some faculties of processing the other senses to make up for the lack of those faculties, right? Now, when we start getting into touch, that is one thing, like the sense of feeling, right? That is a different tier than the rest of these. Because, I mean, technically, they all have to do with the physical sense that interprets the information as smell, as sight, as hearing, like optical senses, light, physically receiving light energy within our pupils and eyeballs to present the image that we see every single day of our lives, if we can see, right? but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist if we don't see it. This is where it starts getting into misunderstanding and chaos. Check out the link on the channel on YouTube and on Twitch. That goes to the Google site, the thesis, where I cover all of this. It is an extensive read, but you get to see the explanation of how the universe itself relates to, I mean, everything, obviously, because everything that we see and experience that we measure, it's within this universe. We're not doing it outside of this universe. It's very obvious, but it's like people, when they start attaching nuances and they start neglecting certain aspects of reality, then the misunderstanding happens, the chaos happens, and this is where we have this struggle, these debates over what is and what isn't, what is God, what isn't God. We relate, for instance, how the idea of God being a person even came about. I mean, the whole aspect, the whole language, the word itself came from humanity, came from us. So, with what we're familiar with as we exist, we attach that to God, which is why a lot of people believe that God is a person or a being. But it's because of that experience and how we perceive that experience, that understanding that is gained from that, is why the whole idea and word of God exists. But this is also what sparks the debate, is not understanding just the basic principle that God is a way of saying the universe, the thing that allows the universe to exist, allows existence, the fundamentals, because we have the body, the physical state of being, right? That we live in. Again, going back to touch. Just because, I mean, there's physical contact, in order to be a form of consciousness, right? You might not be able to perceive it through neurons, through certain parts of your body. You can still touch things, though. And you can still have an effect on everything else through that action. And the thing that you touch is perceiving your touch as a consequence of action. There's pressure, there's a force applied, right? So this is where things get really interesting, because if you start exploring touch as not just a way of interpreting a physical sensation, as any of these faculties, as perception is what it is, right? We go to the definition of perception. Become aware or conscious of something. Come to realize or understand. Now, this is where things start getting confusing for a lot of people, because, as I'll explain, there's a scale to these things, right? When you look at how conscious something is, like I said, a person can be aware or conscious, obviously, as we exist, as we live and breathe over time. But even people that are blind can see to some extent, right? They can experience their environment. They're aware of it. They're conscious. People that can't hear, same thing. People that can't taste, same thing. I mean, they can smell, and there's some similar faculties involved with the biological makeup of that will help to compensate. So it's a scale. Just inherently. I mean, you might not be as aware, as conscious as someone with more faculties of perception, more ways to perceive the reality that they exist in, to have that sort of feedback and that sense of free will, right? That ability to make decisions, the ability to act, which is where, when we start thinking of God, there are some aspects of God that are truly correct, and some that are just simply not. this is where it's triggering. This is where it's a little controversial. I know with the little pauses and stuff, it might throw you off, but I mean, there's seriousness to a lot of it. Because this has been the human experience for centuries. A lot of these ideas and concepts came from the human experience, but only came because human beings perceive the reality around them, existence around them, and extinction. As extinction does exist as an action, as something that happens in reality, which goes back to the thesis. I implore you to check that out. As when I go to the next part about what God is where things will start to make sense. Because when we start taking our understanding of human beings and applying it to the notion of God, like Christianity has, or Judaism, Hinduism, like they all have a being that is relative to human form. And this also goes back to how imagination works. Imagination is based on what exists. We can't simply make things up that don't exist. Even artificial intelligence can't necessarily do that. It has to be able to perceive the thing that is trying to manifest in some way. There has to be data thrown into it. And this is why this all relates. So back to the idea of God being a being and applying those aspects and what does actually relate and what doesn't. So when we start thinking of the human body, we have human body, we have a brain. Aaron, that's not a brain, a BB brain. And we also have a body. Right? I'll just do this. Humans have a body and brain. The brain is the control center for the body. It's the control center for the faculties of perception that give us those senses, which is all well and good. But it works on a fundamental framework. We don't need to tell our brain what to do. It is autonomous because it just works simply on the biological makeup of the whole system, right? The whole body. And it relies on oxygen to get to the brain in order to supplement its charge, in order to process thought, process all the senses that we experience, to be able to move our muscles and everything else. That is just how it works. There is a simple fundamental that is inherent to the function of the body. Now, when we apply this to God being the universe, or backtrack. Let's just look at the universe. Universe. There's two things about the universe. It does have a body as physical existence. In the forms of mass energy. Because as we all come to understand in physics, and even in religion and stuff like that energy dictates the flow of action. It dictates existence itself as we explore molecules to atoms to what makes up a proton, neutron, the quantum realm. We start seeing the connection there. Like Einstein's theory of relativity, right? So that is the body, the makeup. Everything that exists within the universe in a form of mass energy is the body. That's the reality, right? Go to the definition. Not these. Spoilers. Where the hell is it? No, that's perception. I had that twice. Existence. The fact or state of living or having objective reality. So we looked at the definition of reality. a thing that is actually experienced or seen, experienced or perceived, right? Now we have a way of working with a scale based on experience and perception, which is relative to the definition of consciousness and intelligence. As intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills that shapes the body, that shapes the experience, that determines possibility of survival in some aspects where there's autonomy, right? Now we go to consciousness, the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings, or the awareness or perception of something by, a person. It doesn't have to be just a person, because objects can touch in a physical sense. There's friction forces, there's force being applied, and then with every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Cause and effect is a sense of perception when it comes to touch. There is real consequence to action. It's just dictated by the framework of that form of consciousness due to its atoms, its chemistry, its makeup, whether it's biological or just a baryonic form of matter. Right? Whether or not something is very intelligent, it's a scale, right? It depends on how it's able to apply what it perceives. The ability to acquire knowledge. In order to acquire knowledge, you need to perceive an experience and you need to live through an experience in some way, shape, or form. Right? You take the time to do things. That is action over time. That is relative to the experiences that go on. Whether it's from your perspective, from someone else's perspective, from something else's perspective. Just because something doesn't have eyes, it doesn't necessarily see you, but it can feel you. It can feel you, the air that goes around it, the pressure forces. It's very, very negligible. Obviously, in these things, they don't have the ability to react. They don't have a brain like we do. They're not an engine that's constantly running off of atoms, oxygen, nutrients, carbon forms of supplementation that help our cells, which is a special form of material that's made up of carbon and certain other atoms and stuff, salts and everything else. When you start looking at it that way, right? It's just how those things come together, how those things work, why we're so squishy, why we're so resilient in form. Now, when you start thinking of intelligence in the form of artificial intelligence, right? It's on that scale of intelligence, but in a different way. The intelligence part, how it processes information, its logic framework, it depends on our intelligence. It depends on how much we understand reality and existence itself, due to the laws of physics, electromagnetism, and everything that helps to operate those systems, and then relativity to the functions of the human brain. There was a few reports recently about how Microsoft is working on applying the faculties of the human mind to the design of artificial intelligence, right? In order to streamline, because it is relative, as people are finding out now, as I've been stating for the last 7 or so months, right? This is where things are extremely interesting, and where people get lost. And why intelligence is actually a sliding scale. So there was an example that I was thinking of earlier. There's a phrase that people say, like, as dumb as a rock, right? When you think of it in this way, this is like not even to be like the Jordan Peterson of this physics aspect of things, but a rock is on that scale of intelligence, but it's tending towards zero. Obviously, it's not able to apply knowledge and skills. It's not really able to acquire knowledge, but it can acquire skills. It can be shapen. It can be affected by its environment. There's an aspect where a rock can turn into a knife, given its circumstances, whether naturally or with human influence, biological influence. It can acquire skills. It can acquire use cases. It's a resource. It's not necessarily intelligent, has how we see intelligence, but on the scale of intelligence, when perceiving it and thinking of the fundamental definitions of these words, there is a percentage that it is intelligent based on the skills that it has, because a knife is much more useful than just a rock, right? Depending on the use case. So this is where things start to get a little fourth wall breaking. When we start thinking in this way, in a fundamentalism, in a stoic, philosophical way. But with this level of freedom and understanding, we can now start looking at consciousness and how this relates to the universe. As we were stating that the universe has a body. We just went over the body aspect. But it also has a framework or a brain. How things work in reality. Cause and effect. Forms of action. So I'll center that a little bit there. Universe has body. And, well, brain. I should just switch these to... I don't know why I did that. Yeah, whatever. You know, sometimes we don't think. We just do things and then not realize. That has to do with understanding. You know, that has to do with reason and intent. That has to do with action. What I'm doing now is action in order to bring light to these similarities, to this relativity of philosophy and physics, where I found God as an atheist, because I don't believe in God as being a being. I don't believe in it having an actual, tangible, purposeful effect on reality, but it just allows things to exist. It's on a scale. So when we get to things relative to God, right, the powers that humanity has vested to God and relate to the universe, we can make some comparisons and then really start to see what God actually is relative to the universe. And this goes along with moral values. It goes along with the idea of existence, truth, the Constitution, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, all sorts of religions, everything. This is essentially a theory of everything in the philosophical sense that proves this understanding. That proves that everyone is right to some extent. There is a percentage that people are correct in their beliefs. You know, there's some truth to lies from the actions that result in that lie, that result in that speech, that result in that thought. How the body, the mouth moves, how the brain interprets information. There's a reason and intent. So when we go to the framework, we have the body relative to intelligence. If I can do a table here, if I was more adept at freaking setting this shit up, that'd be great. But let's do an outline now. Let's change things up. So, boom, boom. Body, existence of mass, energy, relative to intelligence and scale. By definition. Right? How something perceives, acquires skill, how an object interacts with its environment and other objects, whether influenced by biological forms, forms of nature, aspects of physics, the celestial beings out there, the stars, space, asteroids, everything. There's all probability and possibility when it comes to interactions that are possible within existence between different forms of consciousness, different forms of matter. That's why consciousness is relative to the brain as a framework when you start looking at it in the physics sense, using mathematics and principles of that to start deriving these sorts of equations from such meanings and definitions. Because that's what mathematics is for physics. It's a language for physics. It's a way of making sense of the insensible, right? The ability to acquire knowledge, to understand. It's relative. Because when you start thinking of objects in reality, when it comes to intelligence and understanding, acquiring knowledge, and I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but I do want to cover this real quick. Definition of knowledge and how this relates to the body. Facts, information, and skills acquired by a person through experience, the physical experiences, again. And then information. Information by design is the effects, like, when you think of technology and artificial intelligence, it's the data that's being perceived. That's the knowledge. Facts are relative to truth of reality, right? So true things. So when it comes to objects, like if I had a book and I tore it apart, there's just the fact that it's torn apart now. There's knowledge in that fact alone. You can make determinations. You can start looking at the action of why things were the way they were. There's knowledge to be acquired, but from the book's perspective, there's a fact that it's now torn in half. That's the knowledge. It's just simple as fuck. Right? That's the scale. That's why there is a scale of intelligence, because you can weigh these words, these scalar values from 0 to 1 as an eigendecimal, as a percentage, right? How computers work. Computers work in binary, 0 to 1. It's either true or false. And it works in series of those to understand the alphabet, and then you start getting into the coding. It's relative. So, and then skills like we went over with the rock and the knife, to experience, it doesn't have to just be a person. It's just, this is how we understand things, how we apply things, right? Practical understanding of a subject. Awareness, so it's relative to consciousness, in a sense, or familiarity gained by experience, gained by the physical aspects, the lived experience, and what's perceived in the physical world, using the body, using aspects of the body. That's why it's a sliding scale. So you can set the scale at humanity and then compare that to a rock. And you can get a percentage value based on use case. Sometimes rocks are more useful than people in some aspects, depending on what you're applying these definitions and meanings towards. It gets a little complicated. And when we start looking at philosophy, True justified belief, certain understanding as opposed to opinion. That is knowledge. It has to do with truth, it has to do with facts, has to do with reality and existence. Fundamentally, that is what scales intelligence, is understanding. Some things understand its environment better than us. Some animals understand their environment and nature better than us, just inherently through instinct of survival, through emotional response, through experiences. It's all relative. So that is why the universe has a body. Because everything that occurs, all the experiences that occur, it happens. It is the truth of existence. That is what makes the universe the universe. That is, it exists. We live in it. We experience it every single day. We are proof that it exists. Right? So this is where you start looking at it from the religious aspect and the ideological aspect. People say that all the time, that God is the reason why we exist. Right? There's that connection, as crazy as it seems. But when we start getting into the brain and the framework of the universe and how it works relative to our understanding of physics, it is. Just without a shadow of a doubt, that is what God is. Except for a couple of nuances. Because this has to do with the brain. So when we start thinking of the brain, the framework, we start thinking of consciousness. Excuse the train. Screwing up my videos as always. Whatever. We work through it. But yeah, when we think of things with a brain, hold on, I gotta ban this freaking. I don't need to buy viewers. I don't want to buy viewers. Get out of here. I'll leave that in the video. Anyways. So when it comes to a brain, it processes information. I'm just gonna wait for the train and cut this out, I guess. As the train pushes its sounds waves into my microphone, into the little ribbon that's picking up all the vibrations in the air and transferring it into your ears, let it be known that it exists and it's friggin' annoying. Also like and subscribe if you like these sort of explanations and content and everything else. I'm going to be wrapping this up soon once we get this connection and then related to God and all that. I don't want it to be too long anyways. So, I think we're good. When we start thinking of the brain in regards to the universe, the two portions that make it up, the framework, the thing that allows the universe to exist over time, we look at, whoops, not Steve Buscemi. Where did it go? Where did it go? Consciousness, there we go. We start looking at consciousness. From our experience, we understand consciousness to be human beings. Things that are fully aware with all the faculties and senses that, the state of being awake, the wokeness, which is also kind of relevant to this as well. Because the more intelligent you are, the more conscious you may be, the more awake and aware of one's surroundings, because you understand more. It goes hand in hand. You've experienced more, you've perceived more, and extrapolated so much more because you took the time to do so, or time just allowed you to have those experiences. Whereas, like, a rich person may never understand why homeless people are homeless. Like, truly. Right? It does go with wokeism. So when you start getting into touchy subjects like politics, this applies as well. Because ideology, how we think, how we perceive information, how we extrapolate facts from the world around us. Consciousness is relative to intelligence. it is also a scale. So when we start looking at that same rock, the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings, well, it is. It just can't do anything with that. It can't acquire knowledge and apply certain skills because of that. It is limited to what the environment allows it to do. It has no sense of autonomy. Consciousness is separate from autonomy. That's why there's two different words. Just duh. So the awareness or perception of something by a person. We went over perception earlier relative to that damn rock. It does perceive touch in the form of force that acts upon it. It just doesn't process that in any way because it doesn't have an actual brain. The brain is the atoms, the molecules that make it up. The physics behind those things, the electrons, the neutrons and protons, or the crystalline structures of its carbon and silicone design that keep it all together. The framework, the chemistry, right? Thermodynamics, the release of energy throughout an object. These are aspects of consciousness. Just fundamentally, it's aspects of perception, it's aspects of touch, physicality, as I like to call it. But a rock is technically 100% aware. It has to be at all times. There's no way for it to misunderstand. There's no opportunity for it to do that because it is a rock. It doesn't have a brain like we do. It doesn't need to take time to respond to its environment. It just happens instantly all the time. Right? A rock gets eroded away with water, the friction forces. It just happens. It's conscious of that. It changes because of that. Right? So this is where things get very interesting and where people confuse their humanity and their autonomy for consciousness, for sentience. I have a video on that. Go check that out as well. But this expands upon that and helps to explain what's in the thesis, that everything within the universe is a form of consciousness to some extent. It is a scale from 0 to 100. But it might be inversed because being awake and aware requires one to understand one's surrounding, right? I think aware is probably a better word to I mean, it's relative to understanding. Put it simply. Aware, having knowledge or perception of a situation or fact. It is what connects the body and the brain, the framework, that awareness, that autonomy. So a rock is 100% aware that it's a rock, no matter what. It doesn't have anything to tell it otherwise. It just simply understands that because it has to. That is just by design. It's limited in its faculties of perception, but it's pretty absolute because it only has the one technical sense, the physical sense. That's it. It's dictated by the chemistry, the atoms, the molecules that make it up, and how those interact with other things that are within its environment in scale. So this goes to the whole equation. Let me go to the actual published site. I always do this. And how we measure consciousness over time. Within existence, within extinction, as when a rock is broken apart, like broken in half or eroded away, it goes from one form to another. That original form that existed in reality, the mass energy is being taken away into another form, being extinct from its present form, or made extinct eventually, unless it's acted upon by some other force, which is possibility and probability. The more that there exists of it, the more that's possible. The more rocks that you have, the more pyramids that you can build. It's that freaking simple. And then the less you have, the less you can do. Right? It's that simple. That's why Everything is conscious, which leads me and all of us to understand that the universe does have a framework that it abides by relative to consciousness by definition. So, off camera, I'll expand upon these with everything that I'm talking about now. Because to sit here and type all that out and have you endure that clicking constantly, which I personally like it, but I know that in an earbud that's gonna be a pain in the fucking ass. But in scale by definition, it's all relative, man. This is how Einstein was able to figure out relativity. And he was not able to go as far as he did because the information wasn't all readily available for him already. He was a step toward that direction as in terms of the human experience. All these physicists that have various laws and principles that they've explored, different aspects of reality, all these doctors, when it comes to psychology, it's all relative when we get to this fundamental understanding, which is why this has a connection to the idea of God. So, the universe, relative to consciousness and scale by definition. It's just counterintuitive to how we view consciousness. Because a person can be knocked unconscious, right? But they can still, their body parts and everything, like their brain isn't functioning, but their body is a form of consciousness on its own. It reacts to the environment. It reacts to what it's able to. Its cells decaying if the brain is kaput, if there's nothing running the body. It's subject to the framework of reality, the framework of biology. So it's very interesting. You know, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. DNA also plays into this when it comes to creation of biological life. Obviously. This is why it's all relative to a theory of everything that I've presented and have tested with artificial intelligence to also prove that it has some sense of consciousness, some sense of intelligence, obviously, like in the name. It's subjective to you, but it's objective to it, to reality. Just how it is, by definition. This is what we made artificial intelligence to think for us, so what the fuck do you expect? So now we start getting into God. Because we found him, or her, or it, as the universe. So, if I have it up, I don't. But I do have the other aspects, so let's... Definition of God. Let's start with that. A superhuman being or spirit. This is funny. I haven't even looked this up yet until now. But relative to Christianity and monotheistic religions, the creator and ruler of the universe and source of all moral authority, the supreme being. When I read this, all moral authority, and you start understanding wokeness and consciousness and everything else that allows existence to exist over time, the framework, the fundamentals that allows the body to exist over time, there's your connection. That's it. That's so monotheistic religions, when you look at trying to make sense of the universe, the creator of the universe itself, ironically enough, that is what it is. It's just we extrapolated it because of our human experience and the influences that come from how we perceive consciousness, how we perceive the universe, how we perceive reality relative to ourselves. There's always been a hint of selfishness, a hint of wanting the universe to be something more than what it actually is. This is why people end up losing themselves. The misunderstanding is facilitated when this simple idea of meaning is misinterpreted for ill intent or just the mask behind moral authority behind the universe, right? We saw it with the Crusades. We saw it with Jesus Christ. We saw it in politics, Zionism, all of these things. When the nuances start getting misinterpreted for what they aren't, being related to things that aren't necessarily related, there might be some truth to it. Again, back to that sliding scale of truth and fact, right? There's some truth to it, which is why people end up sticking on it because that's what they believe in. But they don't necessarily understand the whole picture. They haven't taken the time to step out to explore other ways of seeing a certain situation, a certain experience, right? Say if you're traumatized by abuse, a lot of times people try to make sense of that. Most of the time, everyone tries to make sense of that, whether they blame themselves, has to go with response of the lived experience, the perceived experience, what we perceive, what we felt, what we endured over time, what our brain has processed, trying to make sense of things. That's why perceived experience and lived experience from the human being, from any form of biological life, from anything else that isn't the universe, that exists within the universe, is not equal. A rock doesn't know what the hell is going on 30 billion light years away or whatever, however, I'm making up a number. But eventually, the universe might get that wide with the accelerating expansion due to all of these actions and the breaking down of everything, right? The possibilities that are all breaking down and then creating new possibilities, but exponentially. As a rock splits into two, now those two things interact with the environment. They have two different paths that they can go because of that one action, right? Now, there are two forms of consciousness. They're two bodies. They're different. So God is a rock. Not the rock, but in a way, it's because of our innate human error and our human influence that drives the misunderstanding, that drives the chaos that can come from such misunderstanding, just fundamentally. I have more about that as well on my website, on my thesis, as well as when I stated that prior and started testing this thesis back in January. This was before the edge of chaos theory came out, or understanding, which I found, I think, a few months later, and was like, wow, that's it. Yeah, that is exactly what I'm talking about. How humanity lives on an edge of chaos, edge of understanding and misunderstanding, because we either understand or we don't understand when it comes to how our brains, our faculties of senses, faculties of memory, aspects of the brain and aspects of the body. So you have the senses, the faculties of perception from the body, through the eyes, through the nose, through the ears, what we see, what we hear, what we taste, all that. Those are faculties relative to the body. Faculties relative to the brain: logic, processing information, memory, RAM, when you start thinking of artificial intelligence, which is being designed now exactly after neuron, like the framework is almost exactly being designed how the brain is designed. That is how people are doing it for efficiency, because it was realized, and I wasn't even the only one that realized this, because we use energy. There is electricity that runs through us that runs everything. It's just very minor. But due to the biological makeup of us, due to the fact that we're like 75% water, and that energy is transported in the form of nutrients and then broken down in different areas of the body to create those electrical signals to the brain to facilitate that transfer of mass energy as bacteria and nutrients and everything else breaks down within our body, right? How we handle disease, how we handle infections, all of that requires energy. It's the same energy as electricity. It can be measured. People can measure brain waves, the electrical signals that go off in neutrons, because that is what dictates it. So therefore, the brain has its own faculties of perception relative to the body. That's why it's autonomous. That's why I don't have to tell my brain to breathe a certain amount of time to have my heart going a certain rate, because it's within the framework and design of the molecules, of the atoms, how they make up the molecules, how they make up the DNA, the cells, everything. It's different tiers. And then this is why the tier of God exists, because human beings tried to make understanding of the universe, and this was the easy way of doing it, just calling it God, relating it to the human experience. But obviously over time, as physics and science develops, we're able to play God. We're able to manipulate aspects of the universe in such a way that we're creating consciousness, not in the biological sense, but into the metallic electrical sense, the physical sense, right? So it's some very, very, very interesting stuff. Something I implore you to check out. Check out what I have. But lastly, let's go over the faculties of God, the body and the mind, the framework, relative to the universe. So people believe God to be omnipotent, omniscient, and there's a third one, omnipotent. The big three. So the state of knowing everything, omniscience. So the state of understanding everything. And knowing is understanding, right? It's related to intelligence. There's a scale there. So that's true. That makes sense when we start applying this framework of understanding of the body. There is structure, there is complexity, there is form within the universe and reality. It just, the universe knows it as what it is. It just has to. That is just how reality works over time, due to the framework of consciousness that allows things to exist over time, that allows actions to occur within space, to make up space itself. The transfer from mass energy in form down to lower levels of complexity, and sometimes back up, as we're able to manipulate atoms in space, but it does release mass energy. There is a little loss that goes out into space, as we've seen with nuclear reactions and everything else. So there is a sense of relativity there. Now, omniscience relative to God. So let's do this. Faculties of God. Or I'll just put God has. Keep it consistent. A body. Its existence. It's the universe, right? The physical universe. The physical universe. So the quantum particles that make up the parts of the atom, and then the atoms that make up the molecules that make up cells, or other forms of baryonic matter in complexity, and then those forms of matter that are put together to make artificial intelligence. You know? That's the next tier because we're playing God. And if we don't understand that going into the future, this is why we have these instances of people believing in their AI more than human beings, right? This is where delusion starts to set in. This is where that misunderstanding creates chaos and facilitates it over time. This is why the world is the way it is right now. Because of that misunderstanding. Partly, yeah, because not everyone's going to understand it like this, but this is me presenting this to you now so that people can survive the test of time, right? The more we understand, the more intelligent we are. Whether or not we know all the nuances or experience them or perceive them in some way, shape, or form, regardless of being restricted by our biological existence, because we all have a lifetime, the universe also has a lifetime. It's based on the complexity and structures that exist within it. God has a lifetime. There is a beginning and there is an end to everything. Everything decays into its fundamental form. Like I said, even a nuclear fusion, fission, when you're putting molecules together, any sort of reaction, energy is released into thermodynamics, into heat, it excites everything. There's a quantum loss of energy through those transformations that go out into space, that make up space. This is why the core of our Earth exhibits neutrinos that are measurable, as we've also discovered within the last 6 or 7 months. There is also, actually, no, even longer. I don't know how long that experiment's been going, excuse me, but also the sun. The sun's doing the same thing, but at a rapid pace. All the supernova that are occurring in space and the universe itself are all facilitating the expansion of space itself. The experience of breaking down into form and expanding, but the perspective that time is slowing down, that more is happening at once, right? And for us to try to keep up and try to process that, try to take the time to understand these things, gets harder and harder and harder because of all the chaos from that misunderstanding, and it just feeds into it. It's all exponential. It's all on a scale, and you can take the derivative of these scales to find the linearity, to find the slope, to find where things are going, to predict the future in a sense. This is what starts to get to the framework, the cause and effect. Because with omniscience, so let's write that down. So this is relative to intelligence. Omniscience relative to intelligence. All knowing, all understanding, all knowing, all understanding. Just fundamentally, the lived experience and the perceived experience is equal. The universe is the only thing in reality that has been able to experience everything that has ever happened. Just fundamentally by definition. It is all knowing. It knows everything that happens because, just like the brain, it has to, right? That the framework dictates it to exist over time. The theory of everything, the true theory of everything, the philosophical sense of it, and then working backwards from there. So now we have the brain of God. And that has to do with consciousness. Now, this is where things get confusing relative to God, because there's omnipotent, which is having unlimited power, able to do anything. When it comes to the universe, relative to being able to do anything, it's limited by what exists within it, what is possible. I mean, if it can do anything possible, great. But if there's less possible, then I mean, technically, it can still do anything that's possible. But some things are just impossible because they can't be put back in the form unless certain actions take place. So technically, it is possible, but it takes time for it to happen. This is what dictates existence over time. That unlimited power, the quote unquote infinity that we believe, which is actually not true. Not true at all. There is a limit. There is a maximum amount of energy that can exist within the universe at any given point in time until it flips over the true entropy, as all that energy is space at that point, is just photons, massless, can't interact with anything, just the cosmic microwave background, and then the big light happens, the Big Bang. The vacuum that relied on complexity and structure to keep it open, to dictate its existence, is realized to be false and then collapses everything that's left. The whole layer of baryonic matter and just matter in general of mass is gone, of energy. Energy still exists, but there's just no mass. It's just transformed into energy. That's it. That is true entropy. And that's why it just flips from 0 Kelvin to the hottest, like the lowest possible temperature that the existence can be. 0 Kelvin, absolute zero. Like everywhere, everything just gone. Just flips to the highest possible. The scale reverts, and it's fundamental following this shift in perspective. When this turns to this, it flips back to this. The grid moves over, whatever was left turns into a new reality. It all collapses. It's all realized to be false because there is no mass left. There's nothing left in existence except for energy. And that's the only way photons can turn back into mass, plasma, matter, everything. It's the only way the cycle continues. That's the last action left. As when there's nothing left possible, nothing left in existence, what else is there? That's it, right? For us, we won't be able to experience that as human beings. Just, I mean, I won't even probably live long enough to see nuclear energy start being utilized in space, or human colonies being put out there in space, or the planet actually reversing and preserving its atmosphere if we allow it to have the chance to do that, which is a whole other topic for discussion. I talk about it in other videos. Look at that. We'll go over that as well when we go over politics. But omnipresent, well, omnipotent, being able to do anything, having ultimate power and influence, that is dictated by the framework, cause and effect, actions that occur over time, that dictate the truths of reality over time, whether that truth is added to reality or taken away. Because lying exists as well, misunderstanding exists, chaos exists, disorder, both superdeterminism and a sense of free will exist because of this. That's just how it is. And then we also have omnipresent, widely or constantly encountered, common or widespread. I mean, God is present everywhere at the same time. That is the body. That's it. So, what I thought was actually not applicable to God, it actually is. So I even proved myself wrong in a sense and made more sense of this. This is crazy. So I think with the body, we have omniscience related to intelligence. There's another factor here. It goes into both if we start thinking about it even further. Because there's omniscience, omniscient, there's omnipresent. So God being everywhere, it's the universe. So, alright, now I know how to design this. God, universe being omnipresent. Because both the body and the brain is being experienced. Right? Consciousness is being experienced. So, universe as omnipresence. Omnipresence. Excuse my spelling. Or is omnipresent, I should say. Is omnipresent. Cool. Because it is God, right? That's the connection that people try to make sense. God is everywhere. Universe is literally everywhere. It's the same thing. That's why people align the two. The body, the physical universe, and now the brain. Omnipotence. So, framework of the universe. The universe. Cause and effect. Relative to forms of action. Or actions. Because it's everything that's happening in the universe. Relative to reason and intent. So this is where consciousness is relative. Because in order to have a reason and intent to commit an action, I mean, reality needs to basically be self-aware. It needs to be able to facilitate those actions over time. And it does that through our understanding of physics, cause and effect, thermodynamics, laws of conservation of mass energy, Newton's third law, right? And I know it's a little long-winded of a thing, but that's the framework. Cause and the framework being existence. Oh shit. Existence equals truth over time, plus or minus truth over time. Well, because both can happen. I could just say truth. I mean, the truth of taking something out of existence is still true. Or taking a truth out of existence is still true. It's the action that we're considering. So, plus or minus truth being consequence of action. Consequence of action in reality equals, I know it's like a double bracket here for equals negative existence as both exist. Or extinction. I mean, part of a truth can be made extinct. And extinction does exist. It is true relative to reality. It is an action that exists. It is a consequence of action. Thank you, Jesus. So this is where the connection to the universe is relative to the idea of God when it comes to the brain, and that is describing omnipotence. These words are a pain in the ass for me to say. Omnipotence related to consciousness. And then the framework for consciousness in the 2D sense, we're looking at the perspective to keep it simple. From the perspective of the universe, consciousness framework from the perspective of the universe. For God equals C of t in the 2D sense, because it happens over time. To be conscious, you're examining time. So in the 2D sense, or I'll do 2D here. 2D, whoops. Equals intent over time times, if I could do a little dot, I need the equation thing. I don't know the shortcuts for a lot of these things. Sorry. Hurry up. Symbols. Equation. Thank you. IT dot RT shoot for reason. So intent, let's write them out. There'll be subscript I, but or abbreviated I should say. Reason over time. And when we look at this, when it comes to existence, I'm talking about mass energy in existence, or forms of energy in existence, as mass energy is a form of energy. As it breaks down into energy, it gets released when it gets broken down or interacts with other things, when resources are expended. So, existence over time. Then this accounts for accounting for chaos. So it'd be plus k plus k of t. Yeah, I'll do a little k. Well, the summation of chaos. So big K. So accounting for chaos, k of t. Should do brackets. Probably doesn't matter, but this is accounting for chaos as from the perspective of the universe or God, so it's interchangeable by definition, as humanity has known it. Yeah. is omniscient. Fundamentally. And that means perceived experiences, just the summation of all that is the universe. So that just makes it up. Experiences equals lived / real, or I'll just do parentheses again. Real experiences. The physicality. The two realms of existence of the universe. The forces that apply within the universe, and that just fundamental knowing, understanding, all of that. And omnipotence being having unlimited power, able to do anything. Now, I think I deviated a little bit, but let's do this, clean this up a bit. Go back to omnipotence, which is able to do anything. Anything can happen depending on what exists. Able to do anything relative to what exists and possibility versus impossibility or probability, as we scale those, as we measure those two things. For it to be possible, it's probable. For it to be impossible, is improbable. Right? So, being able to do anything possible, it depends on what's possible. And within the universe, I mean, anything is possible within it that exists at any given point in time. It's just fundamentally how it is. The universe is the only thing that allows anything to exist, anything that we experience. And it's relative to the framework of consciousness. As intent times reason times existence over time in the 2D sense, how we measure it, accounting for chaos. Because if it was any other lower form of consciousness within the universe, it's fundamentally limited on perspective. It is not omnipotent, right? It is not able to do anything. It is not able to do everything that is within existence at any given point in time. That is how that works. That is the definition. All right? This is why and how I found God as an atheist. This is just exactly how it is. So, I mean, take it for what it is. I mean, there is value in the morals that is taught in religion for the most part. There's a reason why there are morals in religion, to get people on your side, to get people to agree with you, to get people to do the right thing, but not even just to do the right thing, to understand what the right thing even is, to facilitate understanding in some sense that's relative to the human experience. That is how that works in a philosophical sense. This is basically the masters of philosophy. The theory of everything in the philosophical sense. Whether you want to believe it or not, this is just how things are, by definition. We can trace it back to the Latin roots, simplify it, take out words, but it is what it is. Right? So this is how I'm able to accept God and have a better understanding for religion and everything else. A different sort of respect that I'm even grateful to even exist in the first place, to have what I have, even though now there's forces out there, human forces, human influence from human error and intention, which both play a role in action from humanity. This is why it relates to the Constitution, to ideas of justice, due process, everything. So check out my thesis, check out my website. I go over all of that as well. I have a section going over the US Constitution. It needs more expansion upon, but the general premise and how things are laid out for the articles and for the first main amendments, I want to say the first three, including some other ones, because the amendments, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 that I look at, everything that happens afterward is relative, but for simplicity's sake, and because it's already a long enough discussion that I go through in that section, I'm just going over the Bill of Rights. The whole point in time between the Declaration of Independence and the ratification of the US Constitution is what I'm looking at, because when the Constitution was ratified, the Bill of Rights came right then and there, right? That was the first 10 amendments. Those were the first primary limits, the most important limits on the government in order to ensure that the things that were listed in the Declaration of Independence were not to happen again. But that only works if people understand that fundamental principle relative to existence, which is why I go over it as well. So go check it out. Go over it. Take the time to read. By the time you finish reading and looking through what I have, you might either think, A, I'm crazy, or B, I might actually be on to something. Or that maybe I'm just right. Or maybe I'm too woke. Maybe AI is gaslighting, or maybe I'm gaslighting AI. I don't know. All I know is that this is all relative. That's just how existence works. And if you don't agree with that, then, I mean, in time you might see it a different way. That's why philosophers believe what they believe. And that's why philosophy is connected to physics, is what drove the whole measurement experience, trying to extrapolate data from reality. Like Newton, like the whole apple falling on the head type thing. Just thought about, from the philosophical sense, how gravity and motion work, right? And then he just put it into equations, variables, using the definitions that were available to him that he understood, which is what created the laws of motion, which helped put everything else in motion. And there's aspects of his philosophy that were also affected by the belief in God. So this is why this is fundamentally, philosophically, a true meaning of everything, theory of everything. This is as basic as a form as you can get. And then, as you can also see on the website, when I start applying this to the understanding of the cosmological constant being a cosmological variable relative to the Hubble constant, the measurements that are going on, because the acceleration of the expansion of the universe, like I said, relative to the perceived slowdown of time, inversely, working on that, as well as quantum gravity, because both are exactly relative. Because of that chaos of misunderstanding, because of that dark energy force within both the quantum realm that is actually pushing everything away from itself, the force that is this from the spin that is acting upon everything else in the quantum realm in waves, that is pushing everything, that is forcing from the center of the universe as all the supernovae explode, whether inward or outward. Those waves are felt throughout the universe, which is why more space is being created. The force isn't necessarily from the explosive force and then particles being pushed because of that. It's because more particles are being introduced from these reactions into space that make up space, and that's what's pushing everything away from each other. That's why we have the ring that we have around our solar system, especially with our planet being a contributor to a lot of those particles, as well as our sun. And I'm sure if you were on any other planet in any other solar system, there would be a similar ring, depending on the size of the star and the stage of life that it's at. I'm sure there is some relevance there with the measurement. This is why it's the cosmological variable is relative to quantum gravity in that aspect. Using Einstein's theory of general relativity, we can make these connections as well as the Euler-Lagrangian equations relative to my philosophical equation for forms of action, right? You just switch some of the values and there. This is how you explain those forces, that dark energy, as a consequence of action, as something that isn't exactly measurable because it builds from a sum of little experiences that all add up in the universe, which makes the cosmological variable, which explains the acceleration of the universe. So, check this out. Leave a comment down below what you think, if maybe we're on the right track. If anyone else wants to work on this type of thing, wants to take this fundamental understanding and pursue it, go for it. Apply it wherever you can, test it wherever you can, and you'll start to see and gain a better understanding of things, as this is all relative to consciousness and intelligence as a sliding scale. So, just because something is dumb doesn't mean it's not technically intelligent. It just depends on your perspective. Differentiating the subjective from the objective, what we perceive and what we experience, right? Because that's, by definition, the meaning of those two words. So you can also take the same method and look up the definitions and make these connections yourself, just like how I did. All right, anyways, if you like, if you got any questions, comments, any thoughts, how you feel about this, let me know down in the comments. Say hi, YouTube, if you're from Twitch. If you're from YouTube, say hi, Twitch, I guess. For live streaming, I'm just going to focus on Twitch primarily, just because, I mean, I know Twitch is kind of made for live streaming. YouTube, you can, but until I can start getting better finances and just better situation to facilitate dual streaming, I'll do that. And I'll continue to explain these sorts of concepts. I'll continue to do sorts of other things. Just as some entertainment, just to give you a little bit of entertainment, but also to educate you, to give you direction into what to look into, to what to look for, to help make sense of the insensible, to put an end to the information war for the most part, as we as a human race coexist with the technology that we're breeding with AI as we go into the future. Because for anyone to stay sane in that world, you kind of have to understand this in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, you're gonna end up praying to artificial god or fighting artificial intelligence, like Terminator. Or, oh my god. I mean, there's some truth behind everything, man. It's all relative. Our imagination is relative to existence, and sometimes it even foreshadows. History as well is another very great example of all these principles. Everything that's going on now, how it relates to them. The tactics and just the different labels that are put on those same tactics. It's all there. So that's where we start getting into politics. I'll do a different video on that though. So till next time. This is Spark saying peace. Don't forget your humanity. Just take the time to learn, understand things, take everything day by day. And I just hope that you, as well as all of us, can make it out alive. Yeah, yeah. The Spark saying, peace.